Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. It is Monday, February 23rd. And what I'm doing is every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I am going to be having videos on current controversies unfolding with respect to the unmarked graves or academic freedom or trans activism or whatever issue is coming down the pike. And today, what I've been planning on doing for a number of days is examining and analyzing this interview that Aaron Pete did with a UBC administrator by the name of Marten Youssef. And for people who don't know who Aaron Pete is an up-and-coming Aboriginal leader. He's the chief of the Hope Band, and he has a podcast called Nuanced, where he invites people on to talk about various contentious issues. And he's trying to improve the quality of conversations which are happening in Canada, especially those conversations surrounding Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations. And Marten Youssef is a UBC administrator who is in charge of UBC debates. And I was intrigued when I heard about this interview because on January 22nd, 2026, so I guess about a month ago now, I went to UBC to have discussions about the claim that the remains of 215 children have been confirmed. And I went with a number of supporters and also with Dallas Brody and Jim McMurtry. And they're from the party 1BC, which has been the only political party that's been critical of the deception that's been happening. I'm not aligned with 1BC because I'm old growth left, as Stuart Parker says. But I appreciate honesty in politicians, and I believe that Dallas Brody is an honest person, and she's truly trying to figure out what's going on with respect to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations. Anyway, when I showed up on January 22nd, I first of all did a tour of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, which was plastered with orange shirts, and that was an omen for what was to come. And then when we actually came back with the sandwich boards asking what remains, I was met by an angry mob of seemed like about 1,000 people. And they were intent on pushing me off campus and not allowing me to be able to discuss this issue. So I was very interested in looking at this interview because I was wondering how a UBC administrator was going to discuss the unbelievable events that happened at that campus. You know, was he going to be critical of them? Was he going to try to provide a public relations perspective? These are all the questions that were raised. And so I really wanted, after I watched the video, which I found was fascinating, and also I thought that Aaron Pete did a pretty good job of just getting Youssef to explain whatever he was trying to put forward. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through a post that I've created about this interview on the wokeacademy.info site, because I think that an analysis of this interview will be very helpful in terms of trying to understand what it is that UBC has on its mind when it is trying to say that it wants to have these issues discussed at its university. So here is the wokeacademy.info post that I was referring to. And you just can go into that at the website, wokeacademy.info, and then you'll see the title of this post. And what I've called this is an analysis of UBC Administrator Marten Youssef's comments. And what I'd like to do is just go through these different areas and provide my commentary on a few clips that I have taken out of this discussion. And there's quite a large segment of time in this discussion, which is devoted to Aaron Pete and Marten Youssef talking about what happened at the University of British Columbia. So this interview happened on February 17th, 2026. That's when it was posted. And you can go into the actual interview if you're interested in looking at the whole thing. And as well, it's important to point out that the reason why I was so interested in this interview is because of my great admiration for Aaron Pete. And a number of months ago, I think it was about 5 months ago, we did an interview on my views on the unmarked graves. And I found that Aaron was a great interlocutor. We did some Spectrum Street epistemology in examining how Pete's views different from my own. He thinks that it is likely that there are the remains of children buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and whereas I would strongly disagree. And I was trying to get an understanding of the evidence that he had for that claim, but it was very, very congenial. I think we both learned a lot from one another, and I really am very impressed with Aaron Pete. And I get a bit sensitive when I hear people harshly criticizing him, because I think we need to have a diversity of tactics and diversity of styles. And Pete's style is not the hard-hitting interview style. It's really asking people questions and allowing them to articulate their position in a non-confrontational way. And we should really appreciate that as being one style amongst many. And of course, it's a little bit too nice for my taste, as I've said before. I like to be a bit more hard-hitting in my approach, but, you know, I'm not the tone policer of the universe. I think that we should try to appreciate people who provide insights in various ways. You know, you can take a look at that interview that we had. And as I mentioned in this interview, there's quite a lot of time devoted to what happened on January 22nd, 2026. I went to UBC to try to discuss this question. I was wearing these billboards, what remains, denial or truth. I'd invited a whole bunch of people. In fact, I invited all people in the British Columbia legislature to come and join us. And it was only Dallas Brody, the only member of the legislature, who came. And we basically tried to engage all the people that were there. And there's been a lot of coverage of this on social media. We were met with this huge crowd. They were all pushing against us. And fortunately for a number of brave men who protected me, Andrew Broughton, I think his name is Drew Coover, Hugh Geiger, Blake was another friend of mine who was there, a man by the name of Brian, and another man who I didn't know. They held back this crowd that was trying to basically push us off campus for many, many minutes, like probably almost an hour. And I had a great couple of interviews, even though there was this terrible scene that was taking place. One with an Aboriginal trans person who we engaged. And then the most heartwarming one was with an Aboriginal woman by the name of Melody. And we spoke for about 15 to 20 minutes, and she was very upset about the claims being made about the unmarked graves, and she wanted to know what my position was, and she was crying, and it was very dramatic. And I told her she didn't have to grieve. There was no evidence of remains, so why did people have to grieve? And she was a very nice young woman, and I hope that she learned some things. I definitely learned some things from her. Anyway, at the end of it, the police thought things were getting too unruly, and instead of dealing with this violent mob, they hauled me out and arrested me for trespass and being a nuisance. And this is what you can see on
it's about creating shitty ideas.
What do you know about that? I'm being violently assaulted constantly.
Our police is a disgrace. Our police.
You should be
Anyway, so that was me, in case you didn't notice, being hauled, and I was kind of in shock. I was kind of discombobulated. So I should have been making statements about UBC and its totalitarianism. And in fact, when I was in the police car, I was saying, UBC, this is what you've done with your support for orange shirt totalitarianism, your complete disregard for the academic character of the university. So that was what happened on January 22nd. And so therefore I was very interested to see what Youssef was going to say about this. And he began the discussion talking about the principle of neutrality and the importance of administrators to adopt this principle. And so therefore he seemed to be pretending that the university had been neutral in this situation that had been happening.
Raised such a good point, but you didn't use the sort of the key word, and the key word is the neutrality. I think this is a really key point that often sort of gets lost in the noise. What is the role of an institution in kind of solving the disputes that society has more broadly? Maybe if Aaron, if I may, just sort of talk about the concept of neutrality. It is, at a university level, but also at a sort of a society level and different institutions. I believe that universities particularly have a heightened sense around the need for neutrality. Now, institutions.
So that's something to keep in mind about UBC. Does it have a heightened sense of its need for neutrality?
Neutrality is the sort of the genuine intellectual disagreement. It allows genuine intellectual disagreement to exist. This is an important concept that's sort of been developed over many, many decades. And
in fact, the Kelvin report in Chicago, University of Chicago, that said that, it's not the university's role to take a position.
And it's a core principle that allows universities to serve society and to sort of preserve the campus as a forum for free inquiry and not itself the sort of the arbiter of what truth is. So it can.
Okay, so that's what we have then about neutrality. Is it's there, the university is there to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, not to be the arbiter of what truth is. And the question is that how the University of British Columbia is acting? So that was kind of the introductory sort of area in this discussion. And then Aaron Pete asked Youssef about Widdowson being mobbed and arrested at UBC. And it was interesting, this discussion, because Youssef referred to me engaging in a protest at UBC. And that was very misleading. I was not engaged in a protest. I was coming there just to have the discussion, and it was this huge mob of students and non-students and members of the Communist Revolutionary Party, and I heard there was Samadun, which is another kind of and a pro-Palestinian organization. Anyway, they were protesting, and they were trying to actually boot us off campus, and as well, and Youssef also made a curious comment saying that the reason why there was this kind of violence that broke out is because there was a lack of a mechanism that existed to discuss this claim. Well, shouldn't UBC be facilitating the discussion of the unmarked graves? And now that we had this sort of violent outburst, isn't that how it should be reacting to this situation? And you can hear him talking about this in this clip here.
Okay, so bringing it to the polarization piece, you're hosting these events. What is your reaction when you see what happened to Francis Widdowson, Dallas Brody at the Vancouver campus of UBC? I believe Francis Widdowson was arrested and taken off the property. Like, how does that make you feel as somebody who's trying to move the university in a different direction?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that question. Look, I believe there are ways to have constructive discussions in Canada, and I would say that your interview with Francis about 5 months ago, as it were, is far more effective in settling these differences.
So Youssef has watched the interview that I did with Aaron Pete. He knows how I am interested in having these discussions. So why is the University of British Columbia not allowing Aaron Pete and myself to engage in a discussion about the unmarked graves at UBC campus?
Than protests. Now, I want to be clear. There is a time and place for protests, for peaceful protests, and it's an important part of a democratic society. But I think, how do we move the needle around our ability to be able to have tough conversations? I think it's through debates, it's through one-to-one conversations, not through protests.
This is completely misleading. What he's saying there is that's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to have trying to have one-on-one conversations about the unmarked graves, and I was opposed by this huge crowd of people.
It's my sort of personal conviction. Now, that said, I do want to go back to the January 22nd protest at UBC in Vancouver. And I think it's important to note, Aaron, that UBC knew far in advance that Frances was coming to campus, and we did not try to stop her. Even though the university is a private property and her right to sort of protest is not.
It is not my right to protest. It is coming on campuses to have discussions with people.
Not absolute. We made that deliberate decision because we're committed to free exchange of ideas and the diversity of perspectives.
Is that true? And in order for that to be the case, they'd have to have neutrality as the principle. And do they? That's the question.
I think the fact that it ended the way it did, to be honest with you, is a reflection on the absence of a mechanism for us as a society to deal with these contested issues. I think it would be naive to sort of look at it and say, look, there is the university being broken again.
I think it's definitely the way to I think UBC is broken. And what UBC did that day, it should be understood. This guy is a public relations, arm of UBC and is avoiding what happened. I have, for the last 4.5 years, been trying to have these discussions about this issue, and I have been canceled multiple times. And there's no reason why UBC couldn't go out of its way to make sure that this would happen, that we could have a follow-up to be able to overcome the just unbelievable events that took place. Anyway, so then another segment, Pete asked about why I was doing this, and Pete and I have had conversations about this. That I've been saying to him, I really don't have any option. Like, for example, when I was at University of Regina, I was trying to give 2 talks, and they were canceled, and I had to go in with the Spectrum Street epistemology because the universities will not let me discuss this issue. And even when they do, which was Brock University, quite a successful event, Kevin Gozine, who was one of the people who invited me, people found out that he had invited me, and he lost a book contract because of his association with me. He wrote about that in the SAFS newsletter in January of this year. So there are serious consequences that are happening, and that's because the universities are broken with respect to this issue. We are not allowing this conversation to take place. And so again, Youssef is really avoiding the main.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on the people who make conversations possible. And so what I mean by that is, back taking the unmarked graves story reported by the CBC as an example, that was taken as absolute fact very early on. And then a book comes out called Grave Error that starts to try and lay out a counter argument to that fact.
I just wanted to push back a little bit here against Pete, although I'm very appreciative of him. This has kind of been the tendency, is he's kind of making it sound like the media just covered it as fact. Well, that's because the band orchestrated this deception, and continuously said that the remains of children have been found. So although the media failed because they should have been more skeptical, the source of that deception came from the Kamloops Indian Band. And so I think that's a little bit of a weakness.
That was a very controversial book. You might have heard of some of the responses. I think it was Vernon.
It was Quesnel.
City council or another city council within the area that had gone after their mayor for distributing the book to like friends or something like that. And then other people who have held that book have had to pay a price just for reviewing that book, having access to that book, talking about that book. And then you have individuals like Francis Widdowson, Jim McCurdy, and others who have been willing to engage on this topic when nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so in speaking with Francis, one of her pieces of feedback was, the only reason I'm going to these campuses is because they won't let me in the building to have the type of debate that you're now starting to host.
And so why would Youssef then not organize a debate on this question?
Won't let me in, and so I have to do something. I can't just, to your point about like being silenced, like if the university won't let her point from my understanding is then I have to stand outside the school because they won't let me in the building to host a discussion and to lay out my arguments in a formal manner. And so what I heard from, Francis and I were looking at doing not probably a debate series, but a panel discussion where her and I would share the stage. And they basically said, we don't want to host Francis because she's doing all this stuff on campuses. And it's like, well, the reason she's doing everything on these campuses from her perspective is because they won't let her in the building. And so she's caught in an impossible situation where if she does nothing, she doesn't get the opportunity to speak. And if she does something, then universities don't want anything to do with her because her approach is not something that's palatable to them at this point in time. And I just think about like the sacrifice individuals at times have to make in order to allow the conversation to take place. Now with grave error and with the work Francis has done, I think society more broadly is open to saying, okay, what did happen here? And was that story accurate or not accurate?
And societies are open to it, but universities are not. So universities are massively failing with respect to this issue. Youssef has the tools at his fingertips to be able to set this straight, to make this right. The terrible things that happened on January 22nd. And I'm calling upon the University of British Columbia. It is your duty to be able to enable myself and Aaron Pete to be on your campus and discuss this
and
issue.
Universities are willing to invite me, an Indigenous person, to come and have this conversation, but we don't want to have the people on who maybe started the conversation because their approach was brash at the time, but it had to be brash in response. And I'm trying to think through, how do you find that balance? And I'm not exactly sure what the solution is. I, like you, agree that one-on-one conversations and that path is to me the most palatable, but there are certain people who have to kind of take the most sticks and stones in order to get us to a place where we think it's worth having the conversation. And I'm wondering, how do we approach those people who have had those sticks and stones thrown at them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a really thoughtful question.
Oh, that drives me nuts. This is just like handling. He's handling everything.
Because I think sometimes we also end up just sort of, sorry to use that analogy, but preach to the choir, as they say. And so how do you actually facilitate conversations, difficult conversations, to maybe a crowd that's not necessarily interested in having good faith debate, good faith conversations, which is, again, why the work that we're doing is so incredibly important.
And that work is debates. This is absurd. Here we have this problem. We have the mechanism which they have put in place, yet they will not do it. And that is a good question as to why they won't. And the reason why they won't, we'll see shortly, is that they have a lack of neutrality. They're pretending they're neutral, but they're not neutral on this issue. In fact, they are imposing a prescribed doctrine upon all faculty, students, and researchers, as we'll see shortly. And then another clip, Pete asks how participants are selected. He's pointing again. Pete is saying, I've done all this work on indigenization, and that I got pushed out of Mount Royal for that because I was criticizing Indigenous science. I said Indigenous science is not science. Gabrielle Weaselhead says that this is something that makes her feel unsafe. and that is racist and discriminatory saying that. And so because there's friction claimed to be between me and Gabrielle Weaselhead, I can't be reinstated at Mount Royal University. That is a serious problem that no one is taking, looking at and is dealing with. Youssef, if you watch this clip, maybe we'll try and get to the duty of listening part here.
I'm interested in that same vein
Just gonna try
on
and
how
advance
you
it.
go about
Not necessarily weigh in on it, but I think, Aaron, you are hitting the nail on the head, because what it comes down to is the self-censorship piece that we talked about earlier, which is, it's interesting because there are no laws. There's nothing that exists that says, as a non-Indigenous person, you cannot talk about Indigenous issues. There's nothing that says that. But I think what we have done is, out of this sort of desire to be respectful, out of a desire, it's good intentions, we have actually allowed ourselves not to have the hard conversations. Now, having the hard conversations doesn't necessarily mean having an opinion on it. It just means there's a sort of a duty to actually listen, a duty to
listen. So does Youssef believe that people are listening to the criticisms of the false claims that were made by the Kamloops Indian Band in May 2021? It's not people like Jim McMurtry, myself, Nina Green, Brian Giesbrecht, etc., who are not listening. It's people like Sean Carlton and Negon Sinclair who are not listening. That's the problem. So we need to point out who is the source of the problem and who are working towards trying to solve that problem. And what happens is the people who are actually trying to solve the problem are, sort of seen as being the agitators and the confronters and so on. And then you can see this with certain people, like would you avoid having certain people, Francis Widdowson, to come and present again? Youssef implies that I'm a provocateur, which I'm not. I'm trying to have the discussion.
focus on the content, not necessarily on the guiding principle. How do we create a space for the conversation to be had? What would that look like for us to put someone on stage that has those particular views that can still present the same kind of narrative? In fact, when I do think about one of the topics that we want to have a debate on, let's say the topic of Indigenous issues, I would most certainly be looking to someone like yourself to come onto this particular.
So, but Pete has platforms everywhere. What about the people who are not given access to put forward their ideas? And you can't separate me from, the ideas I'm putting forward. That's why people are upset about me coming on campus, because I am making these arguments, and we should be able to discuss the arguments that I'm making. And if you don't invite me, you're not going to have the arguments that you need to take issue with. Anyway, so one of the final clips, which I find is quite interesting, it's at 2:42 at this in this clip that I've taken, and he's talking about specifically about the 215, whether the 215 should be talking about, and that is at 2:42, which I want to just advance to.
Another piece I'd love to get your understanding of, because I did mention it to Francis, was I see universities as the place for pursuing truth, which is different than having conversations, right? So when we were talking about the unmarked grave story or any other controversial topic, you're going there into a university setting with the understanding this is a place where truth seeking is paramount.
Imagine that. So Aaron and I are completely on the same page with respect to this. Truth seeking is paramount. At the University of British Columbia, with respect to the unmarked graves claim, truth seeking is not paramount, as we will see. And at 2:42, you'll see that Youssef has no interest whatsoever in talking about the 215 graves. He wants to avoid it. He wants to look at other questions when this is the issue that we want to be talking about.
It's an important delineation that I think is key to highlight. Now, to the issue of how do you have a debate on these sort of tough topics? And you touched on a key point. I don't think that the place of having debate, again, is to just pursue the topic that the sort of key individuals are sort of pushing.
So we don't want to have a debate on the topic that the key individuals are pushing. Why not?
I think, for example, you talked about the 215 graves. In my view, I think the bigger issue that's more important to have is reconciliation.
Why is that the bigger issue to have the discussion about? Everyone is blocked at this idea about Kamloops, trying to get to the truth about Kamloops. University of British Columbia, it is your duty to discuss this claim about whether the remains of 215 children have been confirmed at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Reconciliation, we have endless discussions about reconciliation, and we must have truth about what happened at Kamloops, or we are not going to be able to move forward on this claim. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of the overview of the various kinds of clips that Pete. So Pete did, I think, a really quite an impressive job at getting Youssef to discuss a number of these areas. If he had been really confrontational with him, he probably wouldn't have got as much out of him, and we wouldn't be able to look at the contradictions that he's talking about. And that, to me, is one of the biggest ones, which is, why would you not talk about the 215 at this time? Why would you shunt it over to discussions about reconciliation? And that is because University of British Columbia is pandering to the Aboriginal activists and their allies who do not want that claim to be discussed. But in spite of what I consider to be quite a insightful bunch of comments that were put forward and a lot of things that were gone into, much more depth than any other interview I think I've seen between two people who are, to some extent not on the same page. Well, Youssef is pretending that he's on the same page, but he really is just being a propagandist for University of British Columbia. I just made a correction, right? It was not protest. I was not involved in protest. And UBC was not neutral. This is a huge thing. The Dialogue Center, as we'll see shortly, was really there with all the materials that they put on it to encourage the mob to go after myself and Dallas Brody and all the supporters that we had. Anyway, Masha Kleiner, who is a staff member for 1BC, she is kind of castigating Pete for not, sort of calling out Marten Youssef. And he's not a journalist. Aaron Pete's not a journalist. He's a podcaster. I would call Aaron Pete. He was wondering what to call himself. Aaron, if you'll let me give a label to you, I'll say you are a public intellectual. That's what you are. You're trying to bring these intellectual conversations to a wide audience, and you've done incredible work in terms of being able to do that. And then, of course, Wyatt Claypool, who's also a staff member of Dallas Brody. He likes to pretend to be a neutral investigator of truth, but noticeably lets insane left-wing nonsense go unchallenged. That's not really true. He did challenge it. He just wasn't challenging it to the level which Claypool is sort of has as a standard. And I think that might have been counterproductive because we wouldn't have got all the information out of Youssef that he did. And he's talking about the fact, Kleiner's talking about we weren't protesting. It was the Revolutionary Communist Party and Samadoun, which is supposedly a terrorist organization. I'm not sure who was calling it drama. It's true, UBC had us removed. It was pretty terrible. Marten Youssef, he's acting as a public relations agent for the UBC, and he's a propagandist. It's true. But Pete's not a propagandist. and she gives him a choice. Propagandists are incompetent. And Aaron, I'll give you credit, he says he's incompetent. You're not incompetent, and you're not a propagandist. This isn't true. He's not carrying out the interview in a way that some people think he should, but we need diversity of styles. We need diversity of tactics, and this is one approach which I think I commend. Anyway, as well, Masha Kleiner's a bit upset at Pete because of this particular interview that he did about which talked about Dallas Brody.
When you see someone like Dallas Brody, the leader of the One BC party, she is a sitting MLA in the BC legislature, and she's holding up a sign that says 0 bodies, and that's outside of Penticton, in front of a sign that's supposed to be commemorating these children.
In front of a sign that's supposed to be commemorating these children. Like I got to disagree with Pete here on this question. I won't castigate him for it, but I just say, look at that sign that the Penticton Indian Band put up. They have the 215 on that sign. They are perpetuating this falsehood of the 215. And Dallas Brody, quite rightly, just has the sign of 0 bodies, which she's correcting what this sign is doing. What is wrong with that? This is just correcting at the falsehood that's being perpetrated by the Penticton Indian Band on a highway.
Children that were lost at that school or never made it back home.
No, he's saying that they're lost at that school, never made home. There's not one parent who said their child never came home. This is a fabrication.
What goes through your mind as an Indigenous leader and someone who's very involved in these topics?
This is going to be unpopular, but my perspective, I try to be nuanced about it. So on the one hand, I can see that journalists didn't dig into this story to the extent that perhaps Miss Brody would have preferred. And the other piece that I would say is she brought something up, a question that I think has merit to it that makes people very uncomfortable. And I think that those individuals are right to be uncomfortable with how she's raising it and how she's choosing to approach it. And so I have a lot of sympathy for her approach, and I think she's going about it in the wrong way.
I don't understand what's wrong. What should she be doing? I don't understand. You've got this sign there. She's standing up, providing another sign. Why aren't people angry at the Penticton Indian Band for misleading the public on a major highway? I really. So Pete is trying to, he's trying to be conciliatory. He's trying to, maybe he's trying to appease Aboriginal groups a little bit, and that's a difficulty for Aboriginal leaders. You owe your position to, to some extent accepting the tribal support that you're going to be granted. And if you seem like you're too supportive of Dallas Brody, it's probably going to create difficulties for you. So I think that was a bit of an error on Pete's part, but it's a difficult situation too. So I understand why Masha is upset at Pete for that. Whereas I think that the criticism of the interview is a little bit more misplaced. Dallas's tone is hurtful. This is our light in the darkness, and we are destined to stay in the darkness forever. And that was a comment I made. I said, Aaron Pete is a light in the darkness. And what I meant by that was that he is giving us a path forward. He is providing the context. He did question Youssef quite substantially on that. He wasn't aggressive in his questioning. I know people would have preferred that, but at the same time, he got a lot of information out of Marten Youssef. And then Pete saying that you can say hurtful tone and then say that the truth still matters. Well, focusing on tone often is a detraction from the nuts and bolts of the issue. And then Kleiner is saying it's facts. So how many children's bodies have been confirmed at KRS? And it is true, 0 have been confirmed. So we really have to get to the truth of that. I really hope that Aaron and I will be able to do this at a date in the near future. I'm calling on the University of British Columbia. What you fomented at your campus on January 22nd was a disgrace, and you were not neutral. And why were you not neutral? Well, let's take a look at what happened. And so what happened is I showed up with Simon Hargott and Drew Coover and Blake early on, and we went before our event was supposed to start at 11. And we went there at around, I believe, 9:30 in the morning at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. And this is what we found. Okay, that's what they're doing here. Okay. Embrace the truth. Believe survivors? You should not believe survivors. You should not disbelieve survivors, but the survivors have to have their beliefs substantiated with evidence. Heart work is hard work. There's no such thing as heart work. This is nonsense. And then we've got the script here again. This script, which is just invented. We are all family. That's not true. It's tribal, which means that there's the tribal family and the non-tribal family. And you exclude people because they're not part of your tribe. Embrace the truth and keep your heart open. It's not about the truth is determined through evidence and examination of contrary positions. Heart is trying to get your emotions to control all these things. Every child matters. The child with fetal alcohol syndrome in the Saskatchewan doesn't matter to these people. This is ridiculous. Certainly every child does matter, but this has got nothing to do with children mattering, etc. So this has all been done. This has all been done because we're coming here. It's just complete propaganda. This institute or center should be defunded. It is not academic at all, and it is disseminating propaganda to UBC students and faculty and staff. I'm seeing a whole bunch of security. It's in front of, I guess that's the library. And they're getting ready. They're getting ready for what's going to happen. This whole front is all plastered with orange. It's incredible. I cannot believe they've done this. This is just embarrassing for an academic institution. This is infantilizing Aboriginal people. They're pretending that they're children who have, such, weak kinds of character that they're going to get traumatized by having a discussion about what's true and what's false. So there's a bit more that you can take a look at. And I should mention that this is footage for a documentary that Simon Harrogott and I are producing. It was going to be with Juno News, but Juno News, I've severed ties with Juno News. So it's still going ahead. It's just not going to be under the auspices of Juno News. Anyway, that whole episode, when we went down there, you could see the lack of neutrality. That is, to have all those orange shirts and all those slogans, that is not being neutral in this dispute, and is saying that you have to have all these kinds of, sort of pandering to the Aboriginal industry position, which is that you should believe survivors. You should not believe survivors because they're often unreliable. What you should do is not disbelieve survivors. Survivors, it's one piece of evidence that could be flawed, and it needs to be substantiated with other accounts and other pieces of evidence. Anyway, that's what UBC did. Because UBC did that, spent all that time putting all the orange shirts and slogans all over that building, it primed the mob. When what UBC should have done is they should have had the administrators come out, make an announcement to people that we were going to now be having a discussion about these questions, and anyone who engaged in any kind of attempts to shut down the position that they were disagreeing with would be expelled from the University of British Columbia. And we are still waiting for accountability to take place as to what happened on January 22nd, 2026. As well, in this post, what I've done is provided the other sources of lack of neutrality, which exists at University of British Columbia, starting with that building that they plastered with the orange shirts. I've done a post on this as well as a video, and you can go into that post and see what I was saying about this center, which is not neutral, which is propagandistic. And I give a history of what happened with respect to that school. And one of the most important things is the Johnny Mack, who is he's the director of that center now. When there was a situation that happened at the University of Victoria, when I was again shut down there, I believe Johnny Mack put out a statement. I provide a whole background to this center, which I think is very, very important. This is what this center said, that The history of the Indian residential school system in Canada is not a matter of opinion or debate. That physical evidence of unmarked burials are well established and publicly accessible, and that denial of residential school history is harmful. It's a harmful act that disregards the lived experience of survivors and their families. So, you know, this is, you know, Youssef, Marten Youssef, would you consider that to be neutral? Like, aren't you supposed to be providing a forum where people can come together and examine these things? So that just creates the propagandistic environment in which all of this occurs. It should also be pointed out, and I've provided another post on this, is the kind of propagandistic thing that UBC has been involved in since May 2021. And I, you know, provide all the evidence for this, right? Because I'm going to be coming, as I said, on January 22nd, statement on missing children, confirmation of the burial site of 215 children, lowering of flags, all sorts of other entities which are saying this about the discovery of 215 children. So again, Marten Youssef, is that neutral? And don't you have an obligation as a publicly funded academic institution to help correct the record of the falsehood that you helped to spread as an institution? And you can do that by having Aaron Pete and me come to UBC to have a discussion on this matter. And that's not just even me just putting forward my view. You can have a whole panel where you can discuss it. You can have people there criticizing me. I'm not demanding to have just my view being expressed. There's other propagandistic entities on campus, the next one being the First Nations House of Learning. And as well, we have the archaeology department that has been, you know, completely, you know, sort of influenced by these kinds of advocacy considerations. And so what's happening is 1BC is trying to get some accountability out of University of British Columbia. They provided this on X. And what they have is they have their letter that they have sent to University of British Columbia, saying that the UBC failed to uphold freedom of expression on campus, and also the safety issue, what happened, what occurred that day. And Dallas Brody is demanding the following: a clear written explanation of no prior arrangements to control the violent mass, clear written explanation for why one group was ordered to leave, an explanation for the arrest of myself, which we have not obtained, and apology, a clear explanation, and what specific steps UBC administration, UBC campus security, and the RCMP will take to ensure that we can safely return to campus to the future without being subjected to violence, intimidation, and removal. We should be able to have this discussion, and UBC should step up to, you know, basically, you know, help us to examine these issues. So that is where we're standing now with respect to this issue. That is an account of the major things that happened at the University of British Columbia, which you can look at the footage. Simon Hergott created a whole hour of the raw footage at UBC, which will be linked in the description. Then, as I said, Dallas Brody is trying to get accountability for what happened. That was a few weeks ago that letter got sent. And then on February 17th, we have this interview with Aaron Pete and Marten Youssef. Marten Youssef is in charge of debates at the University of British Columbia. So here we have a person who's in charge of the mechanism that we will be able to use to get to the truth about the claim that was made about the remains of 215 children being confirmed at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. What's happening, though, is, as you see from those clips, Youssef is saying, you know, we shouldn't be, that's not an issue that we should be talking about. We should instead be looking at what he calls reconciliation. Why on earth would that be what we would be looking at the University of British Columbia after that horrendous sequence of events that happened on January 22nd? University of British Columbia, if it wants to be neutral, it needs to create a forum where we can revisit all the contentious things that happened and be able to get to the bottom of whether or not it is probable that the remains of 215 children will be found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. George Orwell, the famous analyst about totalitarianism, stressed the importance of having objective truth. Objective truth requires that we understand what happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Thank you very much for listening.